Okay. All right, and let me just move this over and go into slideshow mode. Come on, buddy. There we go. All right. So, anatomy versus physiology. Anatomy is the study of structure, physiology, the study of function. You know, when it comes to anatomy, and you're going to find that as we progress through this whole book, is that when it comes to each system, they usually start by talking about, okay, let's say the skeletal system. Well, what are some of the functions, the general functions of the whole skeletal system? You know, and then they usually start by, addressing gross anatomy, and then you look at microanatomy, microscopic anatomy, and then often including along the way the physiology, the function of those different things. The beginning of the book, like chapter 1, is generally gives you a lot of terminology and language skills that you need to have when we're discussing anatomy and physiology. And then we enter into chemistry, which are the smallest units, not a unit of life per se, but a building block. So we'll talk about chemistry, subatomic particles, different types of bonds and molecules of inorganic molecules to a certain extent, not an organic chemistry class, but that which you need for not only A&P1, but digestion chapter of A&P2. And then we will move on to cells, which is the smallest unit of life. And then we will, move on to tissues, which is how all these cells with common functions will organize themselves into these different tissues. And then we enter into our first system, which is the integumentary system. And then from there on out, you just go from system to system to system. Okay, so we have anatomy, the study of structure, physiology, the study of function. So we have a structural organization of life, which is what I was referring to. This is sort of how the textbooks begin and then progress through the entire textbook. Is the first chapter is generally talking about the different cavities and terminology, directional terms, things we're going to discuss tonight. And then you move on to chemistry, to cells, to tissues, to organ systems, and then an organism. The chemical level, atoms are limited, unique varieties of matter that make up all substances. So that is things like carbon and hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. Molecules / compounds are substances made up of 2 or more atoms. Right? The most common body molecule is water, which is H2O. But we have a lot of organic molecules in the body that we need to look at as well. We have inorganic substances and we have organic. And organic substances have at least carbon and hydrogen, as well as other molecules attached to them. Can be a variety of other elements, I should say, not necessarily molecules, but in an organic molecule, you'll have at least minimally carbon and hydrogen. And those 4 categories are carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids in the body. And so that's why we have to discuss a certain amount of organic chemistry, in the chemistry chapter. The cell is the smallest unit of life, quote unquote. It contains organelles that perform specific functions within the cell that are required for survival. So here we have what is called like a composite cell. We'll look at this again when we get to the cell chapter, because that's the chapter that follows chemistry. And they always show these planetary shaped, I call them, these round cells. But in reality, most of the cells in our body are not really round. I mean, red blood cells are round, but they don't have a nucleus and they're biconcave and they're in the mature form. Some of the white blood cells are definitely round, but most of the other cells in our body, especially found in the nervous system, are not round at all. They have these other shapes. However, they do contain similar and the same organelles. They might have more or them or fewer than them, but they generally have the same organelles. Tissues, are cells that are connected together to perform a common function. So you might have different tissue, different cells, but they're found in, let's say, a certain type of tissue, like muscle tissues. We have 4 major categories of tissues, and we will come back to this, when we actually cover tissues, which will follow the cells chapter. Yeah. But I like to hit on it now so we start getting that kind of ground in. All different types of tissues fall into one of four major categories. They're either a connective tissue, a muscle tissue, an epithelial tissue, or a nervous tissue. And so your mnemonic is semen, C-M-E-N. So connective tissues connect one tissue to another. Connective tissues are often found on the outside of organs as well. Muscle tissue is designed to shorten and lengthen. We have only three types of muscle tissue. We have smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. But their job, their only job, is to shorten and lengthen, contract and relax, contract and relax. Epithelial tissues line hollow organs and cover, sometimes there'll be the covering of an organ. Our skin, the epidermis, the most superficial layer of our skin, is composed of an epithelial tissue. But we mostly find epithelial tissues lining hollow organs. So the first layer that would be in contact with blood in the blood vessel is an epithelial tissue layer. You know, the first layer of tissue within the heart that comes in contact with blood is an epithelial tissue layer that lines the respiratory tree, that lines the digestive tract as well. Those are epithelial tissues, and we'll discuss how they're named and the terminology that we use for them. And then we have nervous tissue. We have two types of nervous tissue. We have neurons and neuroglia. And neurons are cells that can conduct impulses. They send kind of electrical signals down the length of them, down their axon. And neuroglia are specific nerve type cells that are, let's put it this way, they are nerve cells that are uniquely found in the nervous system to help the neurons perform their necessary functions. So all the tissues that we look at through AMP1 and AMP2 will either be, named some kind of a connective tissue, for instance, areolar connective tissue, or dense regular connective tissue, dense irregular connective tissue. So that last name kind of tells you what kind of tissue it is. And then we have of the muscles, we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. Of the epithelial tissues, we have a variety of those, but an example of that is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So in the naming of these tissues, we often use, what I call the last name, identifying it as a connective tissue or a muscle tissue, an epithelial tissue. Organs, body part made of two or more tissues that together perform a specific function. So now when we have different tissues that come together to form, to perform a specific function, we call those organs. And those are, what you're going to look at a lot in the first lab this week, or one of the first labs of AMP1, are looking at different either models or pictures of hearts and lungs and where blood vessels are located, arteries and veins. Where the skin is located, what kidneys, look like, what a liver looks like, a gallbladder, a stomach, a small intestine, a large intestine, a bladder, ovaries, testes, what other organs, whatever we find in abdominal pelvic cavity, lungs, a brain, a spinal cord. All right, these are all organs. And then you're going to identify what organ system they belong in. So that takes us to our different organ systems. So these are groups of organs that work together to perform a vital function. So the, one of the organ systems is the integumentary system, what we refer to as the skin, but it's not just these layers of skin that we have in epidermis and dermis. We have hair on the surface. We have different nerve receptors found within the skin to let you know when the temperature is increasing outside the body, or you're touching something hot or something very cold, or there's pressure on the surface of your body. The skeletal system, the muscle system, the nervous system. And therefore, once we get into the systems, the first system we look at is the integumentary system. Then we move on to the skeletal system, the muscle system, the nervous system, and special senses. And then the remaining systems are covered in AMP2. So the tissues come together to form organs, organs come together to form organ systems, and organ systems come together to form an organism. So examples of different systems are the integumentary system, We have the skeletal system. The skeletal system is kind of underrated. It's not just architecture, sort of, that can withstand the gravitational pull on it. And it's not just for muscles to attach to. And when the muscles shorten and lengthen, they move the skeletal system, and they move you and they allow you to move and walk and be bipedal. But within other areas where we have two types of bone. We have skeletal compact bone, and we have spongy bone. And spongy bone is where we have red bone marrow, and red bone marrow is where all blood cells are, come from or are generated. So the skeletal system is kind of an underrated system where we have, multiple functions. The muscular system doesn't include just the skeletal muscles, but that is part of it. We have smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, and they're designed to contract and relax. And in doing so, it generates a significant amount of heat. The nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord. This is our central processing area, kind of our control centers, that receive sensory information, receive information regarding changes in our external environment and our internal environment, like our internal core temperature, or maybe changing levels of blood calcium or blood glucose levels, so we can make an adjustment to them. Our cardiovascular system, which includes the heart and different arteries and veins that help transport blood. Another underrated system, is the composition of blood and what's actually transported. We have the lymphatic / immune system. The lymphatic system is a tubular system similar in composition to the veins in your body that transport fluid. And in doing so, it transports this fluid that's captured from interstitial spaces and from certain areas of your digestive tract. And it requires that fluid to pass through lymph nodes. And lymph nodes are aggregates of tissue that include white blood cells that monitor its contents for bacteria and viruses, parasites, any kind of invading organism, and initiates what's called the immune response. Lets your body know that there's a foreign invader in your body and that you need to start to eradicate it. And that's where some of the white blood cells come in. Especially your lymphocytes that primarily fight viruses, and monocytes and neutrophils that primarily combat bacteria and parasites. Some monocytes will phagocytize some viruses as well. Then we have the respiratory system, which is our area of what's called external gas exchange, where we can liberate carbon dioxide from the blood and absorb oxygen. And then along with the cardiovascular system, transport that oxygenated blood to all the different organs and cells of the body. The endocrine system is a system of using chemical compounds created by glands of the body that will enter in the bloodstream and be a chemical signal to travel through the blood and target a particular cell, bind to a receptor, maybe on either the surface or the internal region of a cell, to signal it to go to work. Different cells have different jobs, and that's why we have such a variety of cells. Not all cells perform the same function. So sometimes we're stimulating a cell to make maybe a particular enzyme, or maybe stimulating a cell in another gland to make yet another hormone that will go into the bloodstream. Or it may signal a cell to take up glucose, because it's abundant in blood at this point, and taking glucose for when it needs to convert it to ATP in its mitochondria. The digestive system is about taking in macromolecules and substances from your environment, and not only physically, but enzymatically and kind of chemically breaking it down to a molecular size that can be absorbed in your small intestine. And that's why the organic portion of the chemistry is so important, because we look at it now, and then you look at it when you cover the digestive system in AMP2, because a lot of the foods that we take in are macromolecules. So for instance, bread. Bread is a polysaccharide. It's a long chain of glucose molecules. that are arranged in a particular way. So you not only have to chew it and break it down to a fragment that you can swallow and not choke on, but you start breaking it down enzymatically from a polysaccharide to a disaccharide by some of the enzymes that are in your saliva. And you start breaking it down and breaking it down until you finally get to what's called the building block or monosaccharide level in this case, because we're talking about carbohydrates, and that can be absorbed across your small intestine. And then it enters into the bloodstream and it gets transported to the liver and to other areas of body where they take those molecules and now they rearrange them and they use them for other functions. And the same goes for the proteins that we eat and the fats. We ingest them of a certain molecular size, but we have to break them down to the building block level to have them absorbed. If you don't break it down, you're just going to pass through your digestive system and you're just going to excrete it in feces. So the digestive system is the way we take in these molecules and we break them down to a digestible, absorbable form that now can be utilized in other ways by other organs of your body and other cells. And it's generally because all those cells need to have energy to, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, to pay for all these active processes that occur in the cell. And that's really why we consume food. And then we take in oxygen so we can take these carbohydrates or these small molecules and burn them in the mitochondria, one of the organelles of a cell, to make this ATP, because you need to have this energy currency, something to pay for these active processes and pumps and transporting and dragging something from here to there into the cell or out of the cell or across the cell. That all costs money. And that's why we take in food. We have the urinary system, which is a way of filtering our blood, getting rid of whatever metabolic waste products that we want to eliminate, excesses of certain things. For instance, if we have too many hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions or calcium ions, we can eliminate it in urine. The byproducts of cellular metabolism, of breaking down our worn out red blood cells. Well, certain parts of that are actually going to be excreted in urine. So it's a way for us to eliminate, certain metabolic waste products. We can attempt to balance blood pressure and blood volume this way. If you're dehydrated, then you have a tendency to reabsorb more water and you develop concentrated urine. If you drink a lot of fluids, the kidneys will allow you to let that excess overflow, and produce urine down to the bladder and be eliminated from the body. But it has, again, the urinary system, another very underrated system, and other complicated functions that occur there, are regulating blood volume and therefore blood pressure. To balance electrolytes in the body, and especially to help maintain an appropriate pH level of your blood, which is very narrow. We have the reproduction systems, which need to function appropriately to keep reproducing our animal. All animals need to be able to reproduce. And so the only way we can have a successful species is to be able to reproduce them. And then all the systems come together. And so a group of organ systems acting as a unit, is an organism. And that's an example of you, your dog, your fish, your cat, whatever's in your environment, maybe snakes out in the backyard. These systems are interrelated to one another and they're dependent on one another. And, I'll frequently refer to the nursing programs, and nursing programs here, because the majority of people in these classes are generally trying to get into the nursing program. And I understand that there are other, dental hygiene, potential dental hygiene, and respiratory therapy, and radiology students, nuclear med students, that are out there as well. They're just generally fewer of them than we have the nurses. But I'll often refer to, important parts of this that for nursing students you really have to keep in mind, because so much of the nursing program is based on anatomy and physiology 1 and 2, in detail. It's not way above and beyond. If you really have a strong understanding of these systems, then that's half the battle of the nursing program. You have to add pharmacology to it, and that is challenging. Pharmacology is always challenging, But when you understand really these systems, your chemistry and things, it makes the rest of it really allows you more time to spend on new material instead of trying to relearn material that you really should have integrated, from A&P 1 and 2. And so I'll frequently say, in nursing, they love for you to know about these types of things, and how it might be related. And so I'm not trying to exclude anybody else, but, I have pretty good knowledge of what they require of you. And when it comes to these systems, it's something to keep in mind is that when you have one particular organ, or certain cells, and then some of the tissues of a particular organ start to be compromised, that is, or to pathologically function, that's what different disorders are or diseases are. And they always start at a small point and they beget, especially if they're untreated, become, more massive and more massive over time, especially cancers. And as one particular tissue becomes involved, so does a particular organ, maybe not the whole organ, but part of an organ. And as that organ does not function correctly over time because it's diseased or has some kind of pathology, eventually unchecked, it starts to affect other organ systems. And that's where you can start out with, maybe having hypertension issues or cardiac issues that will eventually become urinary system or renal issues. So there's a lot of interrelatedness over time. As one system becomes compromised, it affects the way other systems function as well. So they're very interrelated. This again just shows you our hierarchy, and I would know this for, I know I asked some kind of a question about this on exam 1, where you should know what are the smallest units that we're starting with when it comes to the organization of life, which are elements that are composed of subatomic particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons, and those elements or atoms can be arranged as molecules, and molecules come together to form organelles, and organelles come together to form cells, and cells form tissues, and tissues form organs, and so forth and so on, all the way up to the organismal level. Okay, so moving on from that, we're going to talk about anatomical position and discuss some examples of what and how you would use directional terms. And this is a big part of Lab 1. So anatomical position, we have to have a starting point on how we're going to describe what is to the front of the body, or the top of the body, or toward the, or toward the tail, or toward the back of the body. An anatomical position, because we're bipeds, unless you're laying down on the couch right now, but we stand on 2 feet. So anatomical position is standing on 2 feet, head forward, arms out to the side, and palms forward. And that's how we apply our directional terms. To the front of the body, back of the body. So an anatomical position, the front of the body, if you're looking at your hands, would be the palms of your hands. And the back of your hands, or the posterior aspect, would be what's called the dorsum, or the bony part of your hand. Okay, so anatomical terms, let's look at these. We're going to look at directional terms, some regional terms. I don't go into that in too much detail, but we discussed some of them that are commonly used: body planes and body cavities. By the way, if you ever have a chance to take a medical terminology class, though that's really helpful. I think it's a 2-credit class. You can also often do it online, and it can be used then as an elective, later down the road. But, a medical terminology class is very, very helpful when it comes to A&P 1, A&P 2, and then whatever program you get in, or you're applying for, because you're going to very quickly move into using a lot of medical terminology. And, it's not the hardest class in the world. I'm not going to say it's an easy class, because nothing is that easy, but it's one that you can, again, immerse yourself into and learn a lot from, and immediately benefit from what you learned in a medical terminology class, that's going to help you in A&P 1 and A&P 2. All right, so directional terms, we have pairs of terms like superior and inferior. So superior means toward the head, inferior means away from the head. So a way you might use that, and in the first labs, the lab, when you cover the exercises using directional terms, you're usually comparing 2 points of anatomy to one another. And right now, since this is an anatomy and physiology course, you're still learning a lot of points of anatomy. So, to use it in a sentence, that you have to be referring to terms and points of anatomy that people are familiar with. So let's say we wanted to compare the nose to your chin. Your nose is superior to your chin, but your chin is inferior to your nose. So when we're looking at these 2 points of anatomy, one of those is closer to the head and one is farther away from the head, or maybe toward, the tail end of the individual. So superior means toward the head, inferior means away from the head. Your nose is superior to your chin, but your chin is inferior to your nose. Anterior versus posterior, sometimes we'll use ventral versus dorsal. So anterior means toward the front of the body, posterior means away from the front of the body or toward the back. And 2 points of anatomy that are easy to use and compare are your sternum or breastbone to your spine, because most people know where those are. So your sternum or breastbone is anterior to your spine, and your spine is posterior to your sternum or to your breastbone. Medial and lateral. Medial means toward midline, lateral means away from midline. So if you could drop a plumb line right through the center of your body, because that would be your axial point, that's the most medial point. As you when you're comparing 2 points of anatomy, if one of them is closer to midline than the other, then it's considered medial, and if the other one would be lateral. So if we maybe compare your nose to your ears, your nose is medial to your ears, but your ears would be lateral to your nose. Right? They'd be farther away from midline than your nose is. Proximal and distal. Right now, we use examples of points of anatomy that are found on the extremities, on the arms and the legs, and comparing them to each other. And what you're doing is you're comparing, let's say, we're just going to start with the arms, and we're going to use that example. Let's say I want to compare my wrist to my elbow. Right? Well, the whole arm, the attachment point is at the shoulder. Right? And the way blood courses is, from the shoulder all the way out to the fingertips, and then back. Well, not all the way to the fingertips, but out in the arm and then back. Right? So it goes all the way out, all the way back, pretty much. Right. So its point of attachment at the shoulder, one of those 2 points of anatomy is going to be closer to the ultimate point of attachment, and the other is going to be farther away. When you're farther away, it's called being distal. When you're closer, it's called being proximal. So my wrist is distal to my elbow, but my elbow is proximal to my wrist. And if I was going to maybe compare points of anatomy on the lower extremity or on the legs, maybe the toes are distal to the ankle, but the ankle is proximal to the toes. And then we have the terms superficial and deep. So superficial means toward the surface of the body, and deep means away from the surface of the body. And an example of how we use that, is also a description of pain, especially when you're talking to a patient. You'll often, as you're inquiring to a patient and getting a history, is you might ask them to describe their pain. Does it feel superficial or deep? Is it something on the surface of the body virtually that you can put a finger on, or is it away from the surface of the body, something you can't quite put your finger on? Anatomy that we could use on the body or within the body that we could use this pair of directional terms could be the relationship of the skin to muscles. Skin is superficial to your skeletal muscle, and your skeletal muscle is deep to the skin. Or we could even look at the bones of your skull and your brain inside. The skull is superficial to the brain, and the brain is deep to the skull. So we're just comparing generally something that goes around an entire region. One is toward the surface, and one is deep away from the surface. Superficial and deep. Right. And this, again, some of these images, or most of these are from your textbook that kind of show you examples of proximal versus distal medial versus lateral, anterior, posterior, superior, and inferior. Regional terms. Regional terms are kind of AKAs for areas of the body. Frontal, refers to the front of the body. We have a frontal bone that's one of the bone of your forehead. Orbital refers to the orbits of the eyes. Nasal refers to the nose. Oral, the mouth. Mental is the chin, believe it or not. And this is where medical terminology classes, really help to go through a large number of these terms and how they're used. But we had mental foramen, which are bone passageways, in the jawbone, for nerves and blood vessels to pass through. We have the cervical area, that is the neck area, the thoracic area, which is the mid-back area, the lumbar area is the lower part. The pubic area is where your two pubic bones meet. That's why we'll be studying that when it comes to the skeletal system. Axillary is another word for the armpit area. Sternal for the sternum, abdominal, pelvic, inguinal, so forth and so on. On the following page, it gives you a diagram of pointing to these different areas. But I think these are terms, and I left these on here, of ones that are going to be not only used in A&P or maybe in A&P1, but in A&P2 as well. So I would, spend some time familiarizing myself with them. I'm not going to go through each one. Scapular refers to the scapula. Occipital is your occipital bone is found to the posterior and inferior aspect of the skull. Vertebral is your spine, the vertebrae that make up your spinal column. Gluteal is the butt area. Popliteal is behind your knee. The patella is your kneecap. Femoral is along the femur. So as we progress, through these different systems, these regional terms become part of your vocabulary. And this diagram here showing you the anterior aspect versus the posterior aspect of the human body, are a variety of different regional terms, and they point to the areas that they relate to. Frontal, orbital, nasal, oral, mental, acromial, brachial. Brachial is the upper arm. Antebrachial, is generally the lower or the forearm area. Antecubital is the bend of your elbow, the anterior aspect, and so forth. So I would take a look at those. Depending on your lab teacher, sometimes in A&P, they'll include an exercise, that you need to maybe label up these parts, certain parts, with the appropriate regional term. Okay, body planes. Body planes are ways that we can kind of draw or section the body, creating not necessarily equal portions, but sections of the body. And some of these terms like sagittal, frontal, and transverse come in later. We have sagittal suture, which is a suture that an area where your it's called the parietal bones on the top of your skull come together and meet and fuse down with themselves. And so that particular suture is in the sagittal plane, and thus they call it the sagittal suture. So, and we have a picture that describes also what these planes are. So it gives you a visual. But the sagittal suture is a way of, sectioning the body to create right and left side. So if you took a chainsaw and as you were looking straight at me, you took it and you cut right through my skull, down through my nose, through my chin, through my cervical area, through the middle of my breastbone, all the way through the abdomen, through the pubic symphysis, you would create right and left sides or portions of the body or sections of the body. You could be a little off to the right or to the left of that exact midpoint, but that is the sagittal plane. It creates right and left portions or sides. The frontal plane would be as if I was standing sideways and you took a chainsaw and you cut through the top of my head, down through my ears, through my neck, through my shoulders, through my lungs and my ribs, all the way through my pelvis and my legs, all the way down to my feet. And that would create anterior and posterior portions or sections to the body. The transverse plane is if you're chopping down a tree and you went right across the horizon so to speak, or the transverse plane, horizontal plane. And that divides the body into superior and inferior portions or sections. So in this picture, it shows you, okay, here's the sagittal plane if I cut right through the middle. If, to create right and left portions. And then we have the frontal plane. If I made a cut that way, it would produce anterior and posterior or ventral dorsal portions of the body. And then the transverse plane, I think, is the easiest to see, where you make a cut across and it would divide the body, into superior and inferior portions. Body cavities. We have, there are a variety of different body cavities, but some of our body cavities we need to look at because we have certain membranes that line them. But the major cavities, include what is found in the dorsal cavities and the ventral cavities. So in the subsequent picture, we kind of color code where the dorsal and ventral cavities are located. But by definition, the dorsal cavities include the cranial and the vertebral or spinal cavities, which are found to the posterior or back of the body. And then we have the ventral cavities, which are found to the anterior or ventral aspect, which include the thoracic cavity and the subcavities within those. We'll talk about those, and the abdominal pelvic cavities. Generally, if you're being asked in lab to identify a particular cavity that an organ is associated with, ventral will not be an answer because it's too broad, and neither will thoracic. They will probably be looking for either a pleural cavity that houses the lungs or a pericardial cavity that houses the heart. And the same goes for in the lecture class. There is a separate abdominal and pelvic cavity, but they're both found and lined by the same serous membranes. So we frequently kind of just merge them together as the abdominal pelvic cavity. All right, so in this picture, I like the lateral view because in gold or yellow here are the two cavities that compose and make up the dorsal cavity. That would be the cranial and the vertebral cavities. And then to the anterior ventral aspect, we have the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic. We can see abdominal and pelvic, but they have the same serous membranes around them. All right. The thoracic cavity, when we're looking at the anterior view over to the right-hand side, all right, now you can see where the heart would be located and the two lungs. All right, so we have a pericardial cavity and pleural cavities. The mediastinum is really a region between your sternum and your spine. It's not technically its own cavity. So the dorsal cavity includes the cranial and the spinal cavities. The cranial cavity contains the brain, and the spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. The ventral cavity includes the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. So the thoracic cavity really contains two other cavities, right? The pleural and the pericardial. The pleural means lungs and pericardial for the heart. So those are the two subcavities within the entire thoracic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity contains many of the organs found in the abdominal pelvic area. Now, I will tell you that most organs are found within these two serous membranes, but some of them are technically outside, embryologically formed outside the membrane. Now, that doesn't mean it's not in the general area of your back area, maybe, at the bottom of your ribs where you would find your kidneys, that's actually level with, your stomach and your liver. And yes, it's in that general area, but if these organs are not technically found within the membranes, then they're not considered within the cavity. And when that happens, it's called retroperitoneum. So organs that are generally found in the abdominal cavity include the stomach, the intestines, large intestine, small intestine, the liver, and the spleen. I will tell you that parts of the large intestine actually go out of the membrane and come back in, but for all intents and purposes, the 99%, 90% of the volume of your small intestine and large intestines are all found within this cavity. And in the pelvic region, which is toward the inferior aspect, we have the urinary bladder and some of the reproductive organs. I mean, not all reproductive organs, especially male, are found within, the pelvic cavity. You have the testes that are outside the body. But for females and for some of the males, reproductive organs, they are going to be found, within the pelvic cavity. Organs in the cavity, include the uterus and the ovaries for the females. And those not found in the abdominal pelvic cavity, such as the testes, the kidneys, and not only the kidneys, but part of their ureters, which are the tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder, essentially are retroperitoneal. The pancreas is retroperitoneal, and parts of the rectum, or really the rectum entirely. So some of those organs are not associated with any particular cavity. One of the exercises that at least we do here, in AMP1 is identifying the cavities associated with a variety of organs that you're going to be looking at. And it's especially helpful when you're doing these face-to-face, because different manufacturers of these kits, and all these models of organs that come with, this body that you can buy and use in laboratories, they have different appearances. They come from different manufacturers, and so the lungs, although they look morphologically the same, they're shaped the same, they might be different sizes and painted different colors and things, so they have a slightly different appearance. And it's good to see, okay, these are a pile of lungs that come from different models of manufacturers, but they generally look all the same. They're the same shape, and the same for looking at different livers, whether it's one from, an infant liver or it's from an adult liver, where the size of it matters. Looking at different examples of a pancreas, and a kidney and a spleen, and that becomes, quite helpful. So that's generally what you're doing in one of those exercises in the first lab. And then you're assigning it to, a particular system that it's associated with. So if you were looking at a liver, then you're going to learn, okay, that is associated with, or part of the digestive system. And then they'll ask you, okay, well, what cavity would it be found in? It would be found in abdominal pelvic cavity. And you would go through the entire list of all the organs you need to be able to recognize and be able to associate it with the system, which system it's associated with. If you're looking at ovaries, then it'll be part of the reproductive system. Lungs would be part of the respiratory system. You look at a diaphragm, which is a muscular wall, and even though it's muscle, it's technically part of the respiratory system. And then you identify what cavity they might be found in. Well, not every organ that you're going to be looking at is found uniquely within one cavity. So something like an artery or a vein. Well, some arteries and veins are found within cavities, but not exclusively. So they would be an example of the cardiovascular system, but they are not part of any one cavity, or the option might be no cavity or none, something like that. But a stomach is part of the digestive system and part of the abdominal, or found in the abdominal pelvic cavity. The lungs would be part of the respiratory system and found in the pleural cavity. The heart would be part of the cardiovascular system found in the pericardial cavity. But the diaphragm that I just referred to is functions within the respiratory system, but is not contained in the cavity. It's actually between cavities. So identifying organs and recognizing them visually for what they are, and then you generally need to identify what system and what cavity they're associated with. So all I'm saying is that some of these, this is why some of these will be considered no cavity, or none for a cavity associated with them, because they're technically not found within the serous membranes that are part of the walls of the different cavities that we're going to look at. Other body cavities include the oral cavity, the digestive cavities, the nasal cavity, sinus cavities that are found, in your frontal bone, maxillary bone, ethmoid, and sphenoid bones. We'll look at those when we get to the skeletal system. We have the orbits of the eyes. Those are a cavity. We have a cavity in the middle ear, behind your eardrum or your tympanic membrane. We have synovial cavities that are fluid-filled cavities between bones, or many of our bones. And so, but the ones we're primarily going to be looking at and identified cavities associated with different organs will be the ones we had just described. These are just additional cavities of the body. Okay, then we have what are called serous membranes. And serous membranes are these two layers of tissue that come together and have fluid in between the two. And this allows organs to stretch and move without rubbing against the walls of their cavity, or maybe other organs that are adjacent to them, especially in the case of the heart versus the lungs, because they're right next to each other. And both of those organs are regularly kind of expanding and distending and then collapsing back down again. And they're, immediately adjacent to one another. And so to keep them from rubbing and producing friction, we have these two layers of tissue. The parietal layer is the layer that's most superficial and lines the cavity wall. The visceral layer, is the deeper of the two and is intimate or adjacent to the organs that it's surrounding. So you always have a parietal, which would be more the superficial layer, and the visceral, which would be the deeper layer that's intimate. Viscera means organ, intimate with the organs. And then we take that and we further divide or subdivide these membranes into their cavity. So the two membranes that surround the heart are considered the pericardium. You have a visceral pericardium and a parietal pericardium. We have the pleura, or the membranes that surround the lungs, and the peritoneum are the two membranes that surround and define like the abdominal pelvic area. So surrounding the heart, we have the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. So the visceral pericardium is that layer that's intimate with the heart. And then you would have some fluid, and you'd have the outer connective tissue layer, this layer called the parietal pericardium. And that way, as the heart moves, there's plenty of fluid between these different layers so that they move kind of seamlessly adjacent to one another. Then we have the membranes that surround the lungs. We have the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. The visceral pleura is intimate with the lung itself. The parietal pleura would be deep to the cavity wall with fluid in between the two. And then we have the peritoneum, found in the abdominal pelvic area. The visceral peritoneum is a layer that's deepest and intimate with the organs. Parietal peritoneum would be attached to the cavity wall. So I would be familiar with those terms. I know I ask, questions about that. What would be the layer, of, and most of these on the exams are multiple choice, true and false, and matching. So, if you forget, then, there's always kind of a little prompt there, but I would definitely just rehearse, what does it mean to be visceral versus parietal? And then you go, okay, pericardium, cardia is for the heart. So that must be where, that must be the membranes that surround the heart, and pleura refers to air and lungs. So those must be the layers around the lungs. And then peritoneum is the only one left, and that would be surrounding the abdominal pelvic area. I like this picture because it kind of shows you, what it's like for the heart to sit within these two membranes and where they're found. So if you took your hand and you had a water balloon, let's say, and you were able to, and it wasn't totally, the balloon wasn't stretched entirely with water, you could take your fist and displace, the surface of the balloon and, press your fist into that balloon. And that's kind of how the heart sits in these two different, the two serous membranes. The serous membranes are continuous with one another, but you have fluid in between the two layers. And that fluid just helps reduce friction. Okay, homeostasis is the ability to maintain stable internal environments. So your body is constantly doing this. It not only maintains a stable environment as far as like body temperature is concerned, but it needs to maintain an appropriate blood pH. It needs to have appropriate blood glucose levels, blood calcium levels, hormone levels that will be actively adjusted, very dynamically within the body. To do that, we have to have a way of letting your brain and spinal cord, which is your control center, kind of your CPU, your central processing unit in the body, to let it know when things are changing to the outside or the inside, so it can make some kind of an adjustment. And that always begins with some kind of a stimulus. We have these feedback mechanisms. We either have negative feedback loops or positive feedback loops, and we're going to define those in just a minute. But to have a feedback system, and this is basically how computers work as well. So you people are going to techie people, you know, it was kind of developed based on how the human body works. So your body has to be able to detect some kind of change in the environment, you know, either an internal environment, like your blood sugar levels, your blood glucose levels, or maybe, let's say, the temperature outside your body, or, you know, where you're putting your hand down, maybe on a hot stove. You need to be able to know that there's a change in the temperature that your hand is coming in contact with, so you don't burn off your skin. So it starts with some kind of a stimulus, and a stimulus produces a change in a particular variable, such as, you know, body temperature, or the temperature coming in contact, let's say, with your hand or with your foot. We're just going to use that as an example. So, you know, let's say you put your hand down on something hot. The stimulus is going to be, you know, increased temperature. On the surface of your body in that particular area, we have free nerve endings, and they are pain and temperature receptors. So toward the surface of our body and scattered throughout internally in our body, we have these different nerve type structures that respond to a change in the environment, and they're called receptors. You know, so a free nerve ending is a pain and temperature receptor. You know, we have baroreceptors that respond to changes in pressure exerted on blood vessel walls. We have chemoreceptors that respond to chemicals that are present, you know, in the environment. We have pressure receptors, especially like on the surface of our body, that let you know when something very light is landing on, you know, is putting pressure on your skin, or maybe something very heavy is on the surface of your skin. It all starts with some kind of receptor. And it's kind of like a thermostat in your car or in your house, you know, is that when the temperature changes, the thermostat detects that. That's essentially a receptor. And then your thermostat sends a signal to, you know, whatever you have, you know, if you have central heat in there, then it sends a signal to, you know, that motor unit. And if it's, the temperature is going up, like it is generally right now, then it sends a signal, you know, to respond by condensing. The condenser is going to create more cold air and then send it through the duct system. So it comes out into that particular room or to the entire house. And now the temperature goes down, right? And the receptor detects that. And once it comes back into the range that it's preset for, then you stop generally pushing out more cold air, and you leave it alone until the temperature rises again, in this case. And then when the temperature rises beyond a certain set point, then the, you know, the thermostat sends another signal to the compressor puts out cold air until it gets cooler, and then it shuts itself off. That's an example of a negative feedback loop. You start with some kind of a stimulus. You have something that detects the change, which would be a receptor. That information is taken, you know, to your control center, which then determines a particular response to address this issue. It sends a signal out to some kind of effector, which then responds to the stimulus as directed by the control center to return the variable to a normal range. And that's a lot of blah, 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 blah. But the more examples you see of negative feedback loops, you know, versus positive feedback loops, this all becomes really secondhand, you know, and especially when you look at, you know, central heat and air, how air conditioning works when it's getting hot out, or how the heating system would work, you know, in the event that we actually get that cold. I mean, it does get fairly cold here in the winter. So, you know, what stimulates the heat to come on? Well, it starts with these particular components, some kind of a change in the environment, you know, something that detects the change, and then, you know, it gets transmitted to, you know, a particular compressor to either produce cold or hot air, whichever you need to have. And then, you know, it addresses that issue to generally correct it back into a normal range of some kind. So this balance beam kind of at that, you know, or board is showing you the balance of most things in the body. And, because once we finish the chemistry portion, you'll see how vulnerable certain molecules are in the body to extreme temperatures and changes in pH that might occur in your blood, because proteins will, what's called denature, it'll break their hydrogen bonds. So, although we now technologically have ways of manipulating our environment, thousands of years ago, we did not have that ability, and so we are as vulnerable as any other animal out in the environment to extraordinary changes. And, without having houses and electricity and oil and things to produce heat when we need it, and cold air that makes us more comfortable, when we need it, we would be very susceptible to changes, internally that could essentially lead to your death. Right? So you need to be able to be dynamically responding to not only your external environment, that happened to be the example I just gave you, but also changes internally, to different oxygen levels, carbon dioxide levels, sugar levels, calcium levels, hormonal levels that have to maintain a stable environment in your body. And most of that stability is required because of the proteins that we have there. But we'll talk about that more when we get into chemistry. All right, so our two feedback mechanisms are negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops. The majority, I will tell you, 98% of the feedback mechanisms in the body are negative feedback mechanisms, which means that when we have, for instance, I gave you the example of increasing body temperature. If your body temperature goes too high, what do you start to do? You start to sweat, right? Unless you're, in the air conditioning and your body temperature isn't going up. If you are outside, like the majority of today, your body temperature is going to go up. It was a fairly warm day. And what does your body do in response to that? You have an internal thermostat in your hypothalamus. It sends signals to your autonomic nervous system to stimulate your sweat glands to release fluid on the surface of your body. And that sweat is mostly water. And as it evaporates from your skin, it takes heat with it. And so in the process of sweating, you cool down the body. So you started with elevated body temperature. Now you're ending with lower body temperature, or maybe back to normal body temperature. So what you end with is the opposite of what you start with. Right? So you shut off or decrease your original stimulus. It causes a change in the opposite direction, to that of the initial change. Most of our body systems are negative feedback loops. Because once things go out of our normal range, and that's something that you have to hammer in, the whole point of having a normal range is that you probably, not as dynamically as maybe blood glucose levels, but levels go higher than normal and lower than normal. And when that happens, it's not normal. It should be adjusted. So we have some mechanisms that very rapidly adjust, let's say, glucose levels or changes in blood pH very rapidly to bring it back into a normal range. And some of them aren't so dynamic, aren't so rapid. They will address the change, but it might take a little bit longer. And it's not, the time to modify that level isn't as crucial as glucose levels and blood pH, for sure. So once something goes out of the normal range, and if it functions with a negative feedback mechanism, then once it goes out of range, you bring it back into range. If it was a high level initially, it will be a lower or normal level. If it was a lower than normal, let's say lower than normal body temperature, then the goal at the end of this mechanism is to elevate your body temperature or bring it back to a normal. A positive feedback mechanism means we increase the original stimulus to speed up a response. So it's sort of like a snowballing effect. The change occurs in the same direction as that of the initial change. So examples of that are labor contractions. Once, if a woman is pregnant and she needs to deliver this baby, the muscles in the uterus are not going to have one little contraction and go, okay, am I done? Like, well, no, you have to contract and contract until that fetus is expelled from the body. Micturition is a fancy word for urination. The same thing. Once the bladder fills with urine, there's a point where you need to let it be drained through your urethra. So when you go to the restroom, and you prepare to relax, to let your bladder contract and expel all the urine there, it doesn't just have one little contraction and then it's done. It needs to contract and continue contracting until most of that urine, as much as possible, is passed through the urethra and out of the body. So that's an example of a positive feedback mechanism. Most clotting mechanisms are positive feedback as well. They will keep clotting and getting, and developing a more significant clot until finally we stop it by using different enzymes, hormones, so to speak, and different products like plasmin to dissolve the clots. All right, so that takes us to our first Kahoot. Kahoot, or I think it's kahoot.it, is if you're using your phone or you're on a computer, you can put that address in there. I know there's an app for it you can put on your phone as well. So when we get to these, you just kind of tap on it and then you put in the PIN number that hopefully these will be working correctly. And then you can participate and play with it. And most students, people find that it actually is rather helpful. Sometimes you see these exact questions on an exam. These Kahoot questions were written by students that a while ago, like 5 years ago, I developed an extra credit project for students who wanted to form groups to create these Kahoot quizzes, because I'm better now, but I was really technically and computer-wise very inept when it comes to how you do all these things, and that I essentially assigned it to them, and I let them make questions, which was actually a very good study tool for them. So some of these are kind of tough questions. You may have 10 seconds or 20 seconds to answer the question. And then we'll often come back and use these as a form of review when it comes to the exams. It does require me to change my share. For those of you who know how to Zoom and kind of be the orchestrator of these Zoom meetings, is that I have to disconnect my share and go back into another one. And I will just tell you that thankfully we're doing this in the evening where you have less traffic, not only through Zoom, but on the internet right now, so that hopefully it won't get stuck, but sometimes it gets stuck, I'll just tell you. And at that point, since we're, at the end of this chapter, if something happens, then okay, we'll try to pick it up again the next time we meet, and I'll try to find out what's going wrong. But I will just tell you, sometimes at no fault of any fluctuations in the internet, source here to the building, sometimes it's at the Zoom end or something, and something just does not disconnect. But we're going to do our best. Usually, again, at this time of the night or late afternoon, there's usually not a problem. Sometimes during the middle of the day, there are a lot of people accessing Zoom, and it doesn't disconnect and connect appropriately. All right. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and click on here, and I'll give you an opportunity to try to register and add the PIN in. So I'm going to click this. I'm going to stop my share, and then I have to reshare as soon as it clicks in. So I have to kind of toggle a little bit back and forth. Come on. Did it go? Let's try again. Oh, there it was. Okay, now we're in there twice. Let me close this. All right, I'm going to come in as a guest here. And then I think this should work now. There's a lag time between when it kind of, the share option kicks in. Okay, there we go. So you should see this now. Do you see the PIN number 6283005? And that gives you an opportunity to sign in. It has some bad music in the background. There is a way to change this. I might be able to play with that. Let's see. Let me turn it up a little bit so I know what I'm doing. Let's see. We can try adventure. It's okay. All right. even once I start these quizzes, the pin you should still be able to see, because I can't tell how many people are actually going to be logging in. But even if I start this quiz and you're not done, it's usually on the lower right-hand side, so you should be able to continue. So I'll just give you another 10, 15 seconds or so for anybody at home that's going to be logging in. And for those of you who jumped in a little bit late, everything, we talked about briefly about the syllabus. The syllabus is on the course page under course content. The schedule that we're going to be following for lecture and when your quizzes are all due. So we're going to do about 2 chapters a week, and the quiz on those chapters are due that weekend by Sunday night. So please get them done. You get 2 opportunities. Highest grade sticks. What else do I have to tell you? We have 3 exams and then a mandatory cumulative final. Out of the first 3 exams, you will get to drop one after we complete exam 3, and I'll drop the lowest one. There are a couple opportunities for extra credit. I may do an in-person autonomic nervous system, an hour seminar, because ANS is something you use quite a bit in nursing as well as in like physical therapy and things. But if I can think of or provide an opportunity for you to earn some extra points, on not your lowest exam, because that will be dropped on one of the other exams, then I try to do that. And then it gives you sort of another opportunity to really sit down and digest some of this, information, maybe draw some things out, which, is very helpful for learning how this works. And then generally when you complete the SSI at the end of the semester, I give you some points on one of your exams for that as well. Usually 5 points. So everything else is on the course page. The notes are there. And the exams, everything is taken online. Oh, what I neglected to say before was that exam 1 is not honor locked, because generally want to give you an opportunity to become familiar with how honor lock works. Most of you already have experience with it. Probably come fall, all the exams will be honor locked, because most people by then know how honor lock works. But the first exam is not honor locked, but exam 2 and 3 are. So again, because this is a live online, it requires certain technical capabilities. So you need to look at the schedules and make sure that you do not have too much planned during the periods of time when the exams are going to be administered. The quizzes are open. You can work ahead and read through the notes and take your quizzes if you want, and the exams will be open for about 5 or 6 days. And so there's really no excuse to get that done. They will be reviewable after everyone has completed the exams. If you have any other questions, you can always email me. I'm online intermittently, virtually every single day. So maybe Sundays I don't get online too much. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with this quiz. If you have any questions, everything's on there. There's a post up there under the news category to the left-hand side under the course homepage about if you want to go into Pearson and use their study area, but no assignments are on the Pearson website, so you don't have to buy that access, code. If you have a textbook, that's great. You can use an older version or the current version. Your sister, if you have a brother or sister that just took this course, you can use their textbook, but you can get by with all the notes that I provided. Okay, so let's get crack-a-lackin' here. What time is it anyways? 6:53. We're doing well. We're way ahead. Nice. Not good. Most of you did not get fooled. And some of you that didn't answer, you might not have been, logged into the Zoom when we covered that part of the notes. But the smallest unit of life, quote unquote, is one cell. Now, it is composed of smaller units of things like atoms and elements and subatomic particles. But the smallest unit of life, quote unquote, is a cell. Very good. Nice. So what is the most comprehensive? Good. Very good. So remember, I would, when it comes to, especially with the first lab, I'm not teaching any A&P1 labs. I've got an A&P2 that's online. And, I'll just tell you that people love to ask you, like give you examples of the ones that are not contained in any cavity. So you should, like the skin is an organ, part of the integumentary system, but it's not found in a cavity. The diaphragm, um, uh, blood vessels and lymph nodes, and the lymphatic system, it's not contained in any one cavity. The pancreas, the kidneys, the testes, hopefully not found in any cavity. So I would make maybe an extra little flashcard list of like, hey, just as a reminder, don't forget, these are not considered part of any cavity. Good. Very good. Very good. Nice. Okay, very good. All right, so let me get out of this and close this out. Yep, lead page, lead page. Okay. Okay, so that's the end of the first chapter. Luckily, the first, the lecture, isn't terribly long. I will say that, chemistry will probably take most of that take up most of the time on Wednesday night. I might break at one point and then just take a little bit of break. You guys can come and go as you need to, but sometimes I need just to take like a 5-minute break from talking for, over an hour and a half, 2 hours. But we'll see how it goes. If I need to take a little break, I'm just going to say, okay, this is a good time for everybody to take a little break. I'll turn off, the recording and then, or pause it or whatever, and then we'll just kind of get up and walk around a little bit and grab a beverage or whatever you need to do, and then we'll, continue through that because it's a fairly, long interval. So that is the completion of the notes for this evening. Does anybody have a question? When you're doing the Kahoots, if you're shy, you don't have to put your name, you can put somebody else's name and answer it all wrong. No, I'm only kidding. But you can always, just use an acronym, or whatever, use a symbol or something. Some people, they don't do because they're afraid of being wrong and their name coming up there or something. And, so, the more active you are in this and just reading quickly and making quick decisions, some of them go a little fast. I know it's only 10 seconds, but frequently, if you just read it and you go with your first instinct, you're generally right. So any questions? I get to look to see what's on everybody's walls behind them. I don't see any children interrupting you or dogs, so aren't you lucky? All right, then I am going to end the Zoom. I'll let this process and load this up, and under the introduction to anatomy, I'll just say introduction anatomy Zoom. If you need to review that, you can go ahead and do so. Again, for people who came in, you can participate in the Zooms. If you like, I think it's really helpful. Just make sure, as far for attendance purposes, that you're completing your quizzes in a timely manner every week, and your exams. Once you've missed 4 quizzes in a row or 2 quizzes and 1 exam, then you're considered non-participating. So you've got, it's the beginning and you've just paid for all this, just immerse yourself and blast through it. It rolls really quick. It'll be over sooner than you know. So, all right. Well, if you have any questions, let me know. Right.
I do. I've got one.
Oh, certainly. Go ahead.
I didn't want to fill anyone's head with something they can't use, but I was curious. Do adjacent parietal, I think that's the term, right? Parietal serous membranes that are adjacent to each other, like the pericardial and the pleural, are they stuck to each other, or do they also slide to each other? Because I heard that the parietal membrane is attached to the body cavity.
They will slide to a certain point as well, especially the parietal pleurus, because they're actually going to be attached to, right. So if we start outside the ribs, let's say, and you have skin, and then for me, you have some fat, you have your ribs, and then you have what are called intercostal muscles that are traveling in different directions between each rib. And then you have a connective tissue that's deep to that then would become adjacent to a serous membrane. And those serous membranes essentially are attached to the connective tissues of the muscles, because this is what you want. As you take a breath in, or you attempt to ventilate, muscles contract and they elevate your ribs in what's called a bucket handle kind of a movement, like you were doing, lateral raises for your deltoids. And when the ribs go up, then so does the membranes that are attached to the lungs, and thus it pulls the lungs up, out, and when the diaphragm contracts, which is attached to that membrane as well, it pulls it down. And what it does is it stretches the lungs, so you essentially suck in air. That's how you ventilate. And then those muscles either contract or just relax and use air pressure to push your ribs back down, and you squeeze out air. Right? So at some points they're connected to their wall, right? The cavity wall, and sometimes they're not. You don't want the heart and the necessarily the membranes of the lungs to be attached, because they're moving in different directions and asynchronously, so but in some cases that parietal layer will be attached to the walls of the cavity, if that makes sense.
But not each other.
But
Parietal layers of the serous membrane won't attach to other parietal layers.
Because they need to still move very frequently, and they may rub. They won't be like attached. They may make contact periodically, but it won't interfere with their ability to function.
Right, like they're not integrated though. They just touch. Right.
Correct. Good question. You won't have anything that complicated asked of you.
I'm just curious.
But it is interesting. Look, when you get to the respiratory, and you see how these membranes, it's like, oh, that's how you pull on the lungs, is because all the serous membranes are attached to each other and to the walls of the cavity, and that's how you pull on the lungs and create a negative pressure inside to essentially suck in air.
Right, that makes sense, because your lungs can't attach to your diaphragm, or else they'd have no serous membrane.
Not directly, right? They do go through the membranes, right? Exactly. So they're the membranes are kind of moving in different directions, sort of, when you're inhaling versus you're exhaling. It's like stretching a rubber band out and then letting it kind of recoil back again. Good.
That was a good answer. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, then we will meet again on Wednesday, and we will cover chemistry, and quizzes will be due this weekend. All right, if you have any questions, give me a holler.